Good afternoon. Thank you, Senators, for the invitation to address you today. My practice and public writing focuses on the tax issues surrounding charities in Canada. And I've been asked today to speak to you about technical issues, but they arose as a result of a paper I published with the C.D. Howe Institute regarding the donation of shares of private companies and real estate to charities. I expect that you have access to data on the massive amount of wealth held by Canadians, composed of shares of private corporations as well as real estate. Much of this wealth is held by people that have reached the end of their working lives and are considering their estate and any charitable intention they may have. There are currently no restrictions which prevent individuals from donating shares of their corporations or real estate to charity, and there's nothing that would stop a charity from accepting a bona fide donation of these items. Of course, there are taxes to consider. And there are four concerns about these types of donations from a policy perspective. The first is their valuation for purposes of the charitable donation tax receipt. The second is the continued exercise of their voting power by the donor even after the donation is made. The third is, of course, the effect on the tax revenue. And the fourth is the potential misuse of charitable assets to fund a business owned by a charity. As donations of these types of assets are already allowed and considered by the Income Tax Act, it should come as no surprise that provisions already exist to ensure that donations are properly valued and that donors cannot continue to exercise power after their donation. These provisions have been used for many years and their efficacy has been proven. So the first two concerns have already been considered by the Department of Finance and solutions legislated. Assuming a receipt is issued to an individual donor, the tax treatment of such donations is treated no differently than the donation of other capital property. One way to incentivize donations of these assets would be to reduce the amount of the tax payable on donation so that the tax credits generated by the receipt could be used to offset tax owing from other sources. This is the same method that is used to increase donations of publicly traded securities, environmental property, and Canadian cultural property. All of these reduce the tax owing on donation to nil as long as certain conditions are met. The same approach could be taken on the donation of privately held securities, but there's no reason to assume that the rate of taxation should necessarily be zero. If Parliament is concerned about the effect on the tax revenues posed by the tax-free donation of privately held securities, then the tax rate could be set at some amount less than it is, but greater than zero. And for that matter, it could be done for a trial period. This would allow Parliament to judge the effectiveness of the approach with a measured amount of risk. The additional relevant consideration is that charities could end up owning businesses as shareholders and devoting attention and potentially financial resources to these corporations. This is currently allowed and, quite frankly, somewhat useful, but of course, if the Act incentivizes these types of donations, then these occurrences will increase, as will the potential that charities could use funds for which they have issued charitable donation tax receipts to fund businesses that they own. Unfortunately, the governance of charities is a provincial jurisdiction, and these types of rules, if they are necessary, should involve provincial cooperation. The donation of real estate is a thornier issue. As I mentioned earlier, the Income Tax Act already contains a system which encourages the donation of environmental property to environmental charities. If this program, if the donation of, let's call it regular real estate, is expanded, it could undermine the current EnviroGifts program because people with property which could be certified as environmental may consider donations to other types of charities that do not conserve property simply because it is easier or more convenient. There are two ways to deal with this problem. One way would be to enhance the EnviroGifts program to make donations of environmental property that much more enticing, or one may consider a program for the donation of regular real estate that would be less rich than providing the same tax credits as is received on the donation of environmental property. There currently is no good answer for what such a program could look like. I expect that a detailed study must be undertaken to determine a policy position that encourages the donation of non-environmental real estate while avoiding undermining the environmental gifts program. That concludes my submissions, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on these topics.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Aptowitzer. I have one brief question of you. Is you did not address the issue of charities finding themselves indirectly into enterprises, such as take a YMCA may offer some services to their members for equipment, and that ends up becoming an enterprise where it was designed to be a service, but since there's an exchange of money, that there is some enterprise to it. How does that fit into your plan?
Well, you did ask me to keep my answer short, so this may be difficult. What you're referring to, I believe, Senator, are the related business rules within the Income Tax Act. Currently, charities are allowed to undertake business so long as it is related to their objects and ancillary to their overall programs. And there are a variety of guidance points that are put out by the CRA to indicate where they may feel one project falls within the category or not. The difficulty, though, and I alluded to it in my comments, is that fundamentally the governance of charities is a provincial jurisdiction and not a federal jurisdiction. And the rules within the Income Tax Act on related business haven't quite been challenged on a constitutional perspective, but may well be. And I think that a person who made such a challenge would have a legitimate grievance that they're unconstitutional. And so my concern would only be that rules on business being conducted by charities should likely invite provincial participation to help ensure that charities are not receiving funds and then using them to pour into, for perhaps, a bad business in shareholder loans. So I think that is a concern, but I believe it will require provincial participation.
Thank you all for being here. Perhaps I could address my first questions to Mr. Johnson and Ms. McKenzie. Both of you have recommended added incentives so that donations of real estate, privately held securities, RSPs, RIFs, etc., be tax exempt. My question is, do you think this would enhance the total envelope of giving, or would people simply replace their cash donations with these kinds of donations?
Mr. Johnson.
Now, I think that's a logical concern, but a large, I would say 95% of these donations would be incremental. I'll give you one example. A friend of mine has a minority stake in a private company. He's owned it for about 25 years. He can sell the shares in his private company to the founder of the company, the controlling shareholder, at any time based upon a price that's agreed upon by him and the owner, the controlling shareholder of the company. Currently, he can sell his shares for $6 million. Now, if the capital gains tax is removed on private company shares, he will donate $6 million immediately to 2 charities. But each year he donates like $10,000 in gifts of cash to charities. And so if it's removed, there's $6 million compared to $10,000 that he currently gives to charities each year. That's just one example, but I feel very confident that a very large percentage of these donations would be incremental and not substitutions for cash donations.
Thank you. It's a great question. In my first draft of my notes, which clocked in at about 9 minutes, I actually mentioned that, so I really appreciate you asking. I think the answer is, we don't really know, because there isn't a lot of data about the specific giving habits of Canadians, as I said, in relation to their making donations from assets versus cash gifts. But our members, the members of CAGP are experts in strategic charitable giving, and those conversations with donors typically are very different. When you're talking to a donor about making a gift of cash from their income versus a capital asset or an asset which is they're often making the gift at a time of a significant tax event and are using the tax system not to as an incentive to giving, but rather as an enabler of their giving. Our members tell us that their annual giving or their cash giving from their donors typically does not decrease when they're talking to donors about making more strategic gifts from their assets. It's anecdotal, but that's our sense. I mean, I'm sure in some cases people will replace it for one for another, but I think the net amount of giving will go up.
Thank you. Can I?
Senator Duffy had a supplementary, if we could.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a supplementary question on this before our audience loses this train of thought. Mr. Johnson, your friend with the $6 million shares, could you walk us through, for the benefit of those who are watching who are not familiar with the tax implications? So your friend is a minority shareholder in a privately held company. Under the current regime, how much would he have to pay in capital gains tax on those shares that would not go to charity but would go to the government? Approximately. Is it 1/3?
Because he has owned these shares for about 25 years, his cost base is virtually zero. So if he sold his shares now out of the current tax regime, he would trigger a capital gains tax. He'd have to pay income tax on the 50% of the capital gain. So $3 million would be taxable, and he'd be paying $1.5 million in taxes.
More.
So, but because he would be have to pay $1.5 million in taxes if he sold his shares now, he's simply going to hold on to his shares like he's been doing for 25 years.
But to follow through, if we changed and the government were to change the law, instead of the whole $6 million would go to charity, instead of $1.5 million or more going to the federal government out of that gift. So out of the 6, at least 1.5 million would go down the street to the finance department or the tax department. So what we're talking about is a change that makes a significant difference on to the recipients, i.e. the charities, if we were to do this.
Absolutely. It's a removal of a barrier to charitable giving, because nobody gave stock, listed securities, to a charity prior to 1997, because it didn't make any sense, because the capital gains tax that you had to pay offset a lot of the benefit of the tax receipts, so nobody gave stock. Since 2006, when the rest of the capital gains tax was removed and gifts to listed securities, charities have received over $1 billion virtually every year since 2006. Now that's incremental funding for charities, for health care, for education, the two biggest tax expenditures for the government.
Thank you. Back to Senator Omnibus.
I'm still noodling around, are we replacing a basket of apples with a basket of oranges? And I think we all agree that we don't know yet. In the case of the $6 million man, let's also not forget that although he or she doesn't pay $1.5 million in taxes, he or she gets a $6 million charitable receipt for that donation. So we have to weigh all these issues. But thank you so much. We had a discussion earlier with Mr. Malcolm Burrows about this, and I'm sure you know him or know of him. And he talked about the proposal, and he actually has a bit of an addition to the proposal which addresses the question of valuation and management issues by charities, big and small, when they're given, real estate or privately held securities. They have to manage it. And his proposal was that the incentive be tied to donating cash to one or more charities within 30 days of a sale of private shares or real estate. And he actually said, and I quote him, that it would be the proposal is a recipe for disaster without these safeguards built in. And he also informed us that this safeguard would actually incent donors in smaller communities to donate the cash proceedings from their real estate, cottages, etc., to local communities. I wonder if you have a response to that. Anyone?
Thank you. It's an interesting question. That idea was part of the proposals made in 2015, just before Parliament was prorogued and an election was called. So we've had a little time to think about those ones. Part of the problem with that particular suggestion is the fact that when a lot of people sell their corporations, they don't get paid within 30 days. They have a 5-year earnout, or they have a period of time between then and when they get their money. And so they were in the awful position of having to borrow the money to make the donation to hopefully get their money if the 5-year earnout worked out the way it was supposed to go. And so it was fraught with practical difficulties. And again, I go back to the provisions which exist in the Act now. That provision, the reason to donate the funds after a sale is because then you have an arm's length third party that has bought the shares, and so there's no question about the valuation. And so we're not in difficulty. The provisions that exist in the Income Tax Act now are quite good. If an individual donates shares to a private foundation, let's say, they don't get a receipt. If those shares remain in the charity, and if the shares either go public or the charity sells them, then and only then is a receipt issued for the amount that was sold to the third party, let's say, or the valuation in the context of going public. And so the whole issue is made moot by the regulations that are currently within the Act.
Could you allow me?
One more.
One more. Mr. Johnson, you said you were a big fan of the United Way, as I am too. When the United Way received gifts of publicly traded securities, did they develop a policy about some charities have developed policies the minute they get assets of these kinds, they will sell, some will hold. What was their policy around ensuring that the donation gets dispersed to their member agencies?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think the United Way disperses probably about 85% of the donations it receives to these 200 social service agencies across the GTA, and those agencies help the people in need in the communities.
Perhaps I should clarify. I meant, does the United Way in Toronto, for example, hold on to those shares and wait for the share price to go up or down? Or do they sell? I mean, there are policies that these governance bodies have.
They sell the shares immediately.
Okay.
They have no reason to keep the shares. They sell the shares immediately and disperse the cash.
And that's a policy?
Yep. Yes.
Is that your understanding, that that's generally how the sector works?
Absolutely.
When they receive these shares, they have a policy to sell them?
Yeah. The charities don't want to hold on to securities. They want to use the cash to execute their mission. They don't want to hold on to shares.
And if I may add, charities also are subject to a disbursement quota, and so, which means that a certain portion of their assets that are not used in charitable activities must be sold off and then used in their charitable activities the following year. So there are provisions in place for that as well.
Thank you, Senator Oliver. Before we go to the next, Senator, just wanted to acknowledge the presence with us today of former Senator Landon Pearson, who for many years was the voice of the sector in the Senate, and acknowledge her presence and thank her for being with us. We now go to Senator Gold.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. Thank you for being here. In principle, I would support the recommendation that you've all advanced, and I do so. In a previous life, I was on the executive of Centraide, which is United Way in Montreal, and involved in the Jewish Community Foundation of Montreal and of Canada, and I'm the chair of Planned Giving for the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. So I've seen firsthand the benefits, at least to the organizations and charities and groups that we fund, of the change in policy that allowed for public securities to be traded. So I just want, really I have more by way of comment than question, but I did want to thank Ms. McKenzie for your comment also about putting this in the context of planned giving, because in my experience, what this might do is to open up the possibility to large numbers of Canadians who simply don't see themselves as potential major donors, because most folks say, well, big gifts, that's for rich folks. And we've had experience both in a number of these organizations that I've been involved with, where people of apparently quite modest means, when made aware of the options and the tax advantages, especially for planned giving, but also for securities, are able to do magnificent things and make a great impact under circumstances where their annual giving may have been far less even than the $10,000 of the person, Mr. Johnson, you referred to. So the technical issues are important, and the questions that have been raised we will study properly. But for my part, I think if we could amplify the recommendation through the work of this committee, I think it would be of great benefit to all of the people served by all of the charities across this country. I have one small question for Mr. Aptowitzer. I was concerned about the point you raised about environmental land. I actually had that experience somewhat in my business career, where we had land that could have been given to an environmentally appropriate organization, but they weren't really able to take it at the end of the day, and we weren't able to do anything else with it. We didn't want to develop it, couldn't develop it. It just ended up by being of no great use to anybody. So I would look forward to any more concrete suggestions about how to adjust this to not have a negative impact on the environmental groups that will receive it, but to create some incentive for those of us who, for one reason or another, can't find the appropriate group willing to take the particular land that's available.
Right, and in the context of my paper with the C.D. Howe Institute, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think that at the end of the day, there's really one obvious solution, and that is simply not to make the donation of regular real estate as rich of an incentive as the donation of regular real estate. As environmental real estate. Currently, environmental real estate is treated in a different class than any other charity of any kind, and that's because it allows the carry forward of the charitable donation tax credits for 10 years as opposed to 5 years. So there is that, and when I say rich, I don't necessarily mean money. There are other ways that we could look at this. Part of the problem with the set of proposals made in 2015 were that it also allowed for the donation, because it allowed for the sale of the real estate and then the donation of the proceeds, it basically incentivized the donation of environmental property. And then a donor could say, well, I get the same benefit if I donate a portion of the cash or the whole thing, although the calculation is in fact a bit different. So I would suggest if you're going to look at the donation of real estate, and I encourage that you do, and in case my comments aren't clear, I'm very much in support of the donation and a change of tax treatment on the donation of privately held securities as well. But if you're going to look at real estate, I think you must look also at the Enviro Gifts program and ensure that whatever happens on the donation of regular real estate, it is not undermining that Enviro Gifts program, likely with a slightly different program.
Just to loop back to questions about the impact on our tax revenues of expanding incentives for charitable giving. There will be some impact. Well, that's right. I mean, if the plan succeeds, there'll be some kind of trade-off. I appreciate that a lot of this is provincial jurisdiction. As a constitutional lawyer, I tread carefully in this area. But public support for the work of our charities, whether it comes from, and some does come from government directly, and of course through the tax system. Do you have any thoughts about whether increased government support, perhaps it's more provincial than federal, would be an appropriate way to I'm getting lost in my question. I mean, what are some of the policy ways in which we could offset the impact on our tax revenues with this incentive? Is it just a net zero-sum game, or are there ways to at least mitigate the impact on the public coffers?
If I may. That's a very interesting question, and I think it goes back also to Senator Duffy's calculation of the tax owing on a donation or a sale. What's very interesting currently is that in Ontario, the tax credit rate actually does not equal, at the highest, in fact the two highest brackets, does not equal the tax rate. So what happens is, if you earn $1 and donate $1, you still owe 4 cents to the government. So when we look at the balance, the fact is there is still some money left in the provincial coffers. The federal provisions don't do that, much to their credit, I would suggest. But there is a way to measure this out such that the impact on the fisc isn't as great. I would also just take a moment to point out that Mr. Johnson had pointed out the dates, 1997 and 2006, and that's because what had happened was in 97, I believe it was Finance Minister Martin had originally reduced the overall taxation rate, but not to zero. And then in 2006, it was eliminated completely. And so, as I said in my comments, there is a way to measure this without betting the farm on it. You could reduce the rate by half, let's say. You could put a 5-year time limit on it, see the effect before going the full way and making it a permanent inclusion, God willing, in the Income Tax Act. So there are measures.
Thank you. Comment?
Assuming the estimate of incremental donations of $200 million per annum, private company shares of real estate, is based upon an analysis that was done on donations in the United States. The United States, gifts of appreciated capital property are exempt. It includes listed securities, private company shares, real estate. And in Canada, it's only listed securities currently. But in the United States, roughly 80% of the donations of appreciated capital property are in the form of listed securities. Roughly 20%, give or take, each year is from private company shares, real estate. So that's because charities have received over $1 billion virtually every year since 2006. The ballpark number for the incremental donation is $200 million. Now, in addressing concerns of the Department of Finance of the fiscal cost of this measure, the foregone capital gains tax on this additional $200 million of donations is roughly $50 to $65 million a year, and the charitable donation tax credit is the same as for cash donation. So the incremental cost to the federal government is only 50 to 65 million, but charities get $200 million a year. If you add the foregone capital gains tax and the charitable donation tax credit, it's roughly 120 million, but charities are getting 200 million. So it is definitely more tax effective from the government's perspective and the taxpayer's perspective than direct government spending.
Senator Martin.
Yes, thank you. This is a follow-up to what you are just saying and to what you have presented. So I too, like Senator Gold and others, feel that your recommendation is one that I would personally support, and in light of especially the good work that charities are doing and to encourage more Canadians to give such gifts. But if it's more tax effective, and the fiscal cost to the government is, as you say, 55 to 60 million, there must be other reasons why, in your efforts to ask government to take such measures, there's resistance. So I'm wondering if there are other risks, if any, other than the ones you outlined in your presentation about some of the concerns of these types of donations, and you listed 4. But it must be a very complex process, and there's jurisdictional overlap, and we have the provinces that we have to work with. But what other pushback or reasons are being given by government? I think it's important for us to understand both sides in order to make recommendations from our committee. So I'm curious if there's anything that you haven't shared with us regarding, because of time limit, is there what other pushback does government have, other than the fact that it will be a cost to the public purse?
Well, I think I covered the two main pushbacks that one can expect about it's a tax break for the rich. That's been a standard issue every year for the last 24 years, and the concern of it's only going to benefit the large elitist charities. And I think I've tried to address each of those concerns. I think the tax policy professionals in the Department of Finance have always been opposed to these measures, dating back right from 1997 on. And it's very rare for a Minister of Finance to go against the advice of the Department of Finance. In terms of charitable donation taxation, I think it's only happened 3 times that I can recall. Once was in 1997 when Paul Martin was Minister of Finance. He cut the capital gains tax in half. He did it on a 5-year trial period to demonstrate that it wasn't just the big elitist organizations that received it, but other small charities like United Way. And then the next time a Minister of Finance went against the advice of the Department of Finance was in 2006, when Finance Minister Jim Flaherty removed the rest of the capital gains tax on donations of stock. And the third time was in 2015, when Joe Oliver was Minister of Finance. In the 2015 budget, there was a measure that if the owner of private company shares of real estate sold the asset to an arm's length party and gave the cash proceeds to a charity within 30 days, they'd be exempt. And because one of the main concerns of the Department of Finance was concerned about valuation abuse, because for listed securities you have a public market for the stock. For private company shares of real estate, there is no public market. And there's a concern that if you based the tax donation credit on an appraised value, there's a concern about the conflict of interest that the donor retains the services of the appraiser, and there's a bit of a conflict there because the appraiser is maybe incentivized to give an artificially large valuation to the asset. But because because the condition was that the owner had to sell it to an arm's length party, that dealt with any concern about valuation abuse. Now, in the 2015 budget, it was a conservative government, but it had the support of the Liberals and the NDP. Scott Bryson, who was then the finance critic for the Liberals, he was publicly supportive of this measure in the 2015 budget. And the leader of the NDP was also publicly supportive. So it was supported by all three parties in 2015. But at the end of the day, as I mentioned in my remarks, the decision is not made by the Department of Finance, with all due respect. They have the responsibility to oppose any measure that costs the government tax revenues. But the decision at the end of the day is made by the Minister of Finance with the support of the Department of Finance. And in order for the Minister of Finance to be supportive, it's important that members of Parliament communicate their support in Liberal caucus meetings.
Good examples to outline what must happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Senator Duffy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pick up on something that was mentioned by our colleague, Senator Gold, a few minutes ago, and which I think again encapsulates for the folks at home what we're talking about here. Senator Gold mentioned cottages. Many people who don't consider themselves rich have cottages. And we've heard Mr. Johnson and Mr. Aptowitzer, I'm sorry, it's my fault, my apology, talk about when we're dealing with shares in private companies, it all sounds very complicated, and folks at home say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me, but they have a cottage, maybe a small little place in the woods, and it's probably appreciated a ton of money in the time they've owned it. So wouldn't it be in the interest of expanding the pool of donors, much to the benefit of all Canadians, if we simplified the process so that these kinds of gifts don't appear to be so complicated, so difficult that people say, well, I won't bother? I leave it, Ms. McKenzie.
I think that's a great point. I think, as you were inferring, it serves to democratize charitable giving, and as Senator Gold spoke earlier, it's an opportunity for average Canadians to really enjoy the power of philanthropy by making a significant gift that can make a significant change to a cause they care about. And I think that democratization applies to small charities as well, particularly when it's people who have had leisure property in a rural community. They want to support that local community. I think that it's not going to be all about dollars going to big urban charities.
So the challenge for us in our report and for the government which receives the report is to find a way to craft rules that make it simple, in the same way that when people go in to buy an RRSP or whatever, you just check a box and you can provide there for some avenue to help a charity.
Right. And if I may, I think the processes already are rather simple. I mean, the donation of private company shares is signing some documents. Donation of real estate is a conveyance as if you were to buy or sell it. And so the actual having it done is already well established, I would suggest. The issue is the receipting and the valuation, going back to Senator Martin's issue. And I think that's why the current provisions work great. If you're in Muskoka, north of Toronto, and you've got a cottage, those things are pretty easy to sell in that area, a large population base. So you can donate it to a charity, and even if there's a 5-year hold period, chances are the charity will be able to find somebody in 5 years. I think the difficulty is in more rural areas where maybe the market isn't as active, and when we're to donate real estate, or in the case of a small business, donating the shares of a small business to a charity, if the receipt were to be issued right away, charity may have issued a receipt for an asset that's worth nothing. They can't use, they can't sell. And that's why I like the current 5-year reserve provisions, which basically keep everybody saying, listen, whether they really want the gift or not, and whether or not they can sell it. And it makes a lot of sense. And I would suggest that the committee look at the current provisions as a model for simply no need to reinvent the wheel.
We were told earlier today that there's a $2.5 billion gap between what charities will need and what they're projected to receive from the public in donations over the next decade. Surely this makes this a matter of some urgency.
Thank you.
Yes, I think the ideal time for this to happen is in the 2019 budget. And on your comment about cottages, just if someone wants to retire and if they simply sell the cottage, they can give the cash proceeds to a charity immediately.
But there's a tax implication.
No, if they sell the real estate, including a cottage, to an arm's length party and give the cash proceeds to a charity, they'd be exempt from capital gains tax.
Perfect. We've educated the public and me. Thank you.
I mean, it's very simple.
Thank you. Hopefully we generated some gifts through our testimony. Contact the charity of your choice. Senator Amdavar, please.
I have two separate sets of questions, but I want to continue with your language, Ms. McKenzie, the democratization of philanthropy. My concern is for smaller charities, causes that are essential but not necessarily popular. Just as Mr. Aptowitzer, has suggested that there should be some protection for gifts of environmentally, ecologically lands, would you consider an incentive if such a proposal gets passed, that those who donate to charities with an annual revenue of under so much get an additional incentive?
Well, I have to admit that's not a provision that we've considered greatly. I think that if that would serve to level the playing field a little bit in terms of directing charity or donations to smaller charities, I think it's something worth considering and looking at. Sorry?
And I'm basing my question on the evidence. We've heard a lot about, cottages, and lovely as they may be, but the evidence suggests that 60% of philanthropy goes to museums, hospitals, foundations, etc.
Yeah.
I have nothing to tell me at this point that if this is approved, that will change. So I'm looking for some comfort. I too believe philanthropy is good, but I want to democratize. That's my incentive.
Exactly.
So help me out here.
Well, one comment I would make is, and I don't have the exact figure with me today, I could certainly follow up, but I know hundreds of thousands of dollars of gifts of securities go through the giving platform Canada Helps, which is a platform that levels the playing field around charitable giving and is significantly facilitating donations to smaller charities. So that's one example of how that provision is benefiting smaller charities and not just the big ones.
But right, when the evidence rolls up, including Giving Tuesday, all these other platforms that we heard about today, wonderful, the evidence still suggests that there is a trend of high net worth donors to give to charities of a certain kind. But thank you for thinking of this question. I have another question in my short time for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, you said that the cost to the federal government would be roughly $50 to $65 million annually. I have...
Capital gains tax.
Yeah. Malcolm Burrows suggests it would be $190 to $440 million annually, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer suggests it would be $102 million federally with another $50 million provincially. Should we just agree that we don't know?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the foregone cost of the capital gains tax government foregoes is $50 to $65 million a year. That was in a C.D. Howe Institute report several years ago, when they had a special conference on strengthening charitable giving in Canada. And the cost of the charitable donation tax credit is roughly 34% of the 200 million would be about 65-70 million. So the combination of the two, the 50 to 65 plus the 60 to 65 is around 125, 130 million to the federal government. I mean, if anybody wants to challenge that, I'd love to hear.
These are your colleagues, Malcolm.
And also, the 50 to 65 million assumes that the owner of the private company share of real estate is going to sell the asset right away. That is not the case. It's the actual cost to the federal government is the discounted present value of what the government would receive when the owner ultimately sold. That example of this friend of mine that has $6 million, he might he'll give it all to charity if it's in the 2019 budget, but he'll hold on to it for years. So it's a discounted present value of the foregone capital gains tax.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Witnesses, thank you very much for being here today. It's been very informative, and Senator Duffy has continued to try to change the debate into a sales pitch to the audience. I hope it's worked. I hope that there's somebody out there now contacting the charity of their choice to make a major gift, and that would be wonderful. I think I could make one personal comment. The one thing that never gets measured in all of this, but to talk about the cost to government in deferred. In taxes that might not be paid, is the benefit to the recipients of the charitable work, and whether that be the United Way of any community or some other charity servicing Canadians, that can't get measured in the terms of the savings to the taxpayer and to the government. So you've helped clarify this for us. We appreciate it. Colleagues, we'll stand adjourned for a couple of minutes while we retool for the next sitting. Thank you.